Perpetua had a choice, a life of peace with her family or a brutal death for her faith. Her choice has left a lasting legacy, inspiring thousands of Christians to be bold for their faith, even to this day.
The amphitheatre became a regular site of all sorts of martyrdom, but this would end for a short time when Emperor Severus stepped onto the scene. He was favourable toward the Christians because it is said that one day when he was lying in his bed near death due to a severe sickness, a Christian had come up to him and prayed for him, and at once he was miraculously healed. However, this favour didn't last long because the prejudice and the fury of the Roman citizens began to reign once more. Old redundant laws were now revised and used to persecute the Christians, and just like before, the Romans blamed any natural disaster or misfortune on the Christians. It was during this time that a young woman, along with her friends, would suffer in such a selfless and courageous way that their stories are still inspiring people today. With the growing hostility towards Christians, it wasn't safe to openly practice your faith in public. So many Christians would gather under the cover of night in secret. Meeting together one night were two women, Perpetua and Felicity, alongside their pastor Satyrus and a few others. Each of them took turns sharing communion in the dimly lit room, and together they quietly sang songs, worshipping the Lord. Perpetua was mid-nursing her little child when all of a sudden the door burst open. Soldiers began pouring into the room. Immediately the group began to scatter, fleeing out any window they could find, pushing over furniture as they tried to escape through any back doors, but the soldiers were swift and a number of them were captured. Pastor Satyrus managed to escape. The others who were captured begged the soldiers not to hurt Felicity, a slave girl, because she was actually 8 months pregnant at the time. Perpetua's father heard about what was happening, and he immediately got on his chariot and rushed under the moonlight and met the soldiers just as they were about to whisk her away. He stood between her and the soldiers and he begged her, "Please tell these soldiers you are not Christian, that this is all a mistake. Tell them you're not with these criminal slaves." He said this because as far as he knew, being a wealthy Roman and highly respected family in their community, they had never believed in Christianity. But Perpetua, looking at her dad, said, "You're wrong, father. I am a Christian, and these aren't just slaves. These are my brothers and sisters." Shocked at her response, he begged the soldiers not to take her away, but ignoring him, they just ripped the baby off Perpetua while she was still nursing, handed it to the father, and immediately dragged them all away off to prison. While in prison, the father met with Perpetua once more, begging her for his sake that she give up this whole charade. But Perpetua, being grieved by her father's request, looked at a vase next to them and said, "What do you see over there, father?" He looked at it and said, "I see a vase." She said, "And can it be anything other than a vase?" He was confused and said, "No, it can't be. It's a vase." She then said, "And neither can I be anything but a Christian." At this, her father burst into tears and handed his son back. Overwhelmed by the whole situation, he left and went to the governor by himself to try and resolve matters on his own. Back in the dungeon, Perpetua was filled with anxiety for her little one as she sat in the cold, dark prison cell nursing her baby. It was in this place that she had a dream. In her dream, she saw a thin golden ladder that could only fit one person stretched all the way up to heaven. On the way up, on either side, close to the ladder, she could see every kind of iron weapon. There were swords, lances, hooks, daggers, and if you weren't careful on the way up, any one of these weapons could accidentally attach yourself to the flesh and rip you to pieces. Underneath the ladder was a dragon who tried to scare the climbers from climbing the ladder. And then all of a sudden she saw her pastor, Satyrus, who wasn't with them, climb up the ladder, and once up, he turned around and said, "Climb up, I'm waiting for you, and be careful of the dragon." She said, "In Jesus' name, it will not hurt me." She then stood on its head, climbed up the ladder, and when she reached the top, she was in this immense garden. And in the midst of the garden was a large white-haired man that just looked like a shepherd that was milking sheep. And standing around were thousands of white-robed people. He raised his head and looked at Perpetua. "Welcome, my daughter," he said, and called her over and gave her some cheese from the milk he was milking as if it was a piece of cake. She grabbed it and began to eat, and everyone who stood around the shepherd said, "Amen." And the voices of everyone were so loud that it startled her awake, and in her mouth was this indescribable sweetness. She then told the other captives about her dream, and that's when they all realized they were about to be martyrs, and that they could almost taste heaven because it was so close. The Romans weren't allowed to punish women who were pregnant, so if Felicity didn't give birth in prison, her punishment would be delayed, and she would have to face the wild animals on her own. Not wanting this to happen, the group decided to pray for her, and her baby was miraculously born early and raised by a friend in the faith. Also, just in time, Perpetua's infant ceased nursing and no longer desired feeding in that way. It was soon time to appear before the judge. If they offered incense to the Roman gods and renounced that they were Christians, they would be set free. If not, they would be punished as entertainment in the amphitheatre. Each prisoner stood before the judge, and all of them remained steadfast, not renouncing their faith. Her father, seeing that Perpetua was next, begged her, please, for the sake of your son and for the sake of your family, just offer the sacrifices and renounce your Christian religion. She handed him her baby and said, I can't. I will not offer the sacrifice. Her father sobbed and begged her. The guards immediately separated them and beat her father to the ground. She wept over her father as she didn't want him to get hurt because of her. She turned toward the judge and he asked, are you a Christian? With tears in her eyes and bold defiance, she said, I am a Christian. Right there and then, someone pushed through the crowd and looked the emperor in the eyes and said with a loud voice, I too am a Christian. The governor, being confused, said, who are you? It was none other than Pastor Satyrus. He joined them to help comfort them in suffering and to help them get through their darkest hour. He himself said that there's no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. They were all condemned in order to be killed by wild beasts for the enjoyment of the crowd on the next pagan holiday, which happened to be the emperor's birthday. The night before their execution, they all discussed the ways in which they wanted to die. Satyrus didn't want to die by just any wild animal, but asked that he would die with just one bite of the leopard. And when they went to sleep, they all dreamed dreams about their martyrdoms and woke up with an inexpressible joy as heaven just seemed so close. The moment finally arrived, and the crowd was roaring as the group walked out into the amphitheater. All their faces were full of joy and without fear. Perpetua sang psalms as they walked, and when they reached the center and came in view of the emperor, Satyrus yelled out, you judge us in here, but in the end, God will judge you. At this, the crowd booed and yelled and demanded that they be whipped and scourged as speaking out against the emperor. They were placed back in their cells, and the men and women were brought out separately. Satyrus and the men were first, and a wild boar was let loose on him, but instead of running toward him, it went back to his handler, gored him, and killed him. And when they tried to let loose the bear, it just sat in its den and it wouldn't budge. So he was put away in the cell for a time because the animals just wouldn't touch him. A raving bull was arranged for the women. They were stripped naked, hung in nets, and brought out. But when the crowd saw Perpetua's delicate frame and Felicity, who's still leaking from her recent childbirth, they felt bad and urged the soldiers to reclothe them and bring them back out. Perpetua was tossed about by a mad bull and was stunned but not seriously hurt. When she saw her clothes had torn from her side, she quickly covered herself, caring more about her modesty than her suffering. She stood up and fixed her hair because she didn't want to stand before Jesus and appear as if she was mourning. She wanted to go to him proper and filled with joy. Felicity, however, was badly gored, so Perpetua ran to her side and held her while they waited for the bull to come charge them again. But the bull refused to do so, and so the soldiers dragged them from the arena, much to the crowd's disappointment. When she was on the side, as if she arose from a sleep and filled in a state of like ecstasy, she said, I cannot tell you when we're going to be led out to that bull. And the other said, Perpetua, you've already been out there. She didn't believe them at first, but when she looked around and she looked at her injuries and her clothes, she realized that she had felt no pain. She began to encourage everyone around her to stand strong and not be discouraged by her sufferings. Satyrus was brought out again, and he said to the soldier leading him out, just as I have promised and foretold, leading up to now, no animal has come near. So now believe with your whole heart. Watch, as soon as the animals are brought out, you will see I will die with just one bite of the leopard. And immediately, right at the end of the exhibition, he was thrown to the leopard, and with one bite, he died. They brought his lifeless body to where the others would be slaughtered, and he was the first to ascend up the ladder to heaven. After a short time, the girls were brought back out to be killed by the gladiators. Felicity was killed quickly with the sword, but the young, inexperienced gladiator who was tasked with killing Perpetua trembled violently, and he could only stab her weakly several times around her body. Seeing how he trembled, Perpetua held his sword and guided it to a vital area in the body, thus laying her life down for the sake of her faith. The Roman authorities thought that the spectacle of death would only discourage the believers, but they were wrong. The courage of Perpetua, Felicity, and Satyrus only served as seeds for growth of the church, and many people became believers. Her writing is one of the earliest writings ever from a Christian woman, and it shows her desire to make Christ known even after her death. The Roman emperors were right in that the Christian faith was a direct threat to Rome. It would actually be through these martyrs and miraculous events that the Roman emperors themselves would eventually become Christians. Thus, Rome and its customs would forever change as it became a Christian nation.